Hey everyone, welcome back to Chat Cemetery. We are talking all about the 1976 movie adaptation of Carrie with Katie Schaefer today. Katie, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. So excited to talk about this one.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and start with our exposure to this movie, basically? Because personally, I know I had watched it previously, but I don't really remember the context for me watching it. So when I rewatched it yesterday, I was remembering things that I had seen in the movie previously, but then there were other things where I was like, would this have been a movie my parents would have let me watch when I was younger?
Right?
Probably not. So I clearly watched it like high school or maybe even college when I started getting into Stephen King more, because this has been sort of something that's not necessarily brand new to me, but I had only read a handful of Stephen King books before college, if that. And then I started by reading like The Shining in college and everything, and it kind of snowballed from there. And I knew my mom had a ton of his books anyway. So I was like, well, perfect opportunity to just read these. And I started by going back and starting at the beginning with reading Carrie and going through almost chronologically. I skipped Cujo for our Shawshank episode on Welcome to Geekdom. So it's a little out of order right now, but there are so many adaptations of his, and there are, I think, a handful of Carrie adaptations too, but to me this is like the one you need to watch.
Agreed. Yeah, when I did an article about the year of Stephen King last year when he had like 5 things coming out and some of them really big. And so I looked at it and it is crazy. He started having film adaptations of his books almost immediately. Like this one came out in 1976 and I think the book was published less than 3 years previously, and it was his first like big breakthrough moment, and it was directed by Brian De Palma, who even then was considered a pretty big deal. So I think I watched this maybe 15 or 16 when I was going through my like, oh, let's watch crazy horror films phase. And I remember being pretty impressed by how weird and gory and intense this movie is. And rewatching it yesterday, I felt the same thing. So, how did you feel after rewatching it yesterday? Or, yeah, you said yesterday, right?
Yeah. By the time everyone is hearing this, though, it'll be a while ago, though. But
Right, right.
it's one of those things where, it's a good horror movie. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, how well it was adapted from book to screen and everything like that. But, for the time period, I thought this was really enjoyable. I was like, yes, this is kind of what I want out of Stephen King adaptations. And, Carrie is one of those characters where she's sort of just figuring things out along the way as any other high schooler is. She just also has these powers attached to it. So it's even more intense for her because she is not only unaware of things that high school girls should be aware of, but she has these powers on top of it. And she has a mom who, quite frankly, doesn't seem fit to be a mother. So
Right.
it's one of those
She doesn't
things.
care.
Right. And, it's just one of those things where I was like, yes, this is something I can definitely watch and sit down and enjoy it for what it is, regardless of its connections or lack thereof to the book directly.
Yeah, I think it walks a good line between being a good adaptation because the book is, it's done in almost an epistolary format where you're getting a lot of like news articles and all that stuff about it. And then also from the perspective of the people who are living it. So I think it's a decent adaptation up until the end, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And so it's interesting to watch it from that perspective as well, because especially the 70s was a time of, you know, schlock and exploitation cinema, and this walks the line between being schlocky and exploitationist and this interesting commentary on the place of women in the 70s.
Yeah, and speaking of the 70s, I want to quickly talk about how this movie holds up before we dive into the cast and director and crew and everything like that. So, when I was watching this, because of the fact that they use practical effects, and I think that's something that's really key to having movies stand the test of time. Those practical effects make it watchable in 2018. This isn't a movie that has horrendous CGI because it was the 70s and computers were like this whole new thing to so many different people and industries. You just have this sense that, some of these movies, especially Carrie, were sort of built to last because of how they were approached. We don't see some weird powers going on. It's sort of like she looks and the kid falls off the bike. It's not anything more intense than that as far as the imagery goes.
Right. And there's just this brief musical moment that sends it home that this is purposeful. So that you know that, like, oh, this isn't just an accident that the kid fell off the bike. This is Carrie doing this. But it doesn't drag on. So it allows you to, like, oh, that's creepy. And now we're moving along in the story. And I think it holds up well, honestly, because I love 1970s film. And I think, like Halloween, this is one of those movies that you can watch, 40 years later and still be creeped out by, which isn't something most 70s films can claim.
Yeah, and to move on to the casting, because that's a huge part of what makes this movie work so well too. We have Sissy Spacek in the main role as Carrie. We have Piper Laurie as her mother, Margaret White, Amy Irving as Sue Snell, William Catt as Tommy Ross. You even have John Travolta in this movie, who is arguably the biggest name in this movie at the time, probably, but he has such a small part in comparison to everyone else as Billy Nolan. We have Nancy Allen as Chris Hargensen and Betty Buckley in her first role as Miss Collins. I went back and looked at her IMDb page. I was like, wow, that was the first thing she was credited in. And, it was one of those things where as soon as I heard her voice, I was like, I know who that is, even though she doesn't quite look the same these days.
Right?
But I was like, oh, I know that voice. So I went and looked it up. I was like, oh, wow. And that sort of puts into perspective, too, the fact that this was 40 plus years ago. Sissy
Right?
SpaceX, you can still see the resemblance there, but with Betty Buckley, I almost couldn't see it at all. It was more so the voice that did it for me.
Right. And Sissy Spacek, this is like one of her first bigger roles, I believe. And she's so weird.
Yeah.
Like, so weird in this role. She always has these eyes and this facial expression, and they kind of leave her bare, like when it comes to face makeup. And so her freckles pop out and her really pale skin, and they make her otherworldly almost. And so it really sells itself as someone who is outside of that mainstream understanding. I was homeschooled forever. And so I dealt with girls who, in my youth, who wore bonnets and like pioneer style dresses. So I'm familiar with people who they don't have any understanding of this outside world. And I feel like Sissy Spacek's performance really captures that, this almost doe-eyed innocence of, like when in that first scene where she gets her period, she does a great job of portraying the panic and fear and complete misunderstanding of what's happening to her.
Yeah, you also have the fact that in the 70s, they will show a lot more in movies than they will these days that are rated R. So you just
Right?
have all these naked girls running around the locker room. And I was like, wow, did that really happen back then in high school? Because at my high school, like, no one used the showers.
Right? Right? And like they show her thighs and the blood coming down. And I was like, that is not something you could get away with now. You couldn't shoot those scenes because the MPAA would be like, no, I don't think so. But
Yeah.
it's so powerful. And even though I agree, that is not how it was in my high school either. Nobody was showering. You just put your nasty clothes back on and go out and do your thing. But it feels realistic in this film. And the girls feel like almost casual about it. Like, well, this is just what we do. This is how it is.
Yeah, and with it being the 70s, that's not really all that surprising because people felt a lot more free about things back then. And
Right.
I think, just that opening scene with Sissy Spacek, it really establishes the tone for her character, the rest of the film, and her performance. And she really does give a great performance. And it's very believable how naive she can be just because of her mother. And, I put in my notes when I was rewatching this that Piper Laurie is infuriatingly good in the role
I
because
know.
she's this she's portraying this character that you are supposed to hate. I don't think there's anyone who likes Margaret White, even people in the movie itself. You can see the other parents are like, "Oh, I would like to donate and get you out of my
Right?
house."
Right? As soon as the gym teacher finds out, like, oh God, your mom doesn't give you information. Like, you see how the outside world's going to react to someone who keeps their daughter so completely in the dark. And she's Piper Laurie is so great at being that, like, well, I hate you. I hate you so much. But still, I almost understand almost that religious fanaticism and intensity that drive her. But I don't like it. As much as I kind of understand it, I still don't like it.
Yeah, and Betty Buckley's role as Miss Collins is another one where she gets away with a lot of things that we probably wouldn't see in movies today. You wouldn't have a naked student hugging a teacher or anything like that. And
Right?
and then we have her slap Carrie too before that moment, sort of to just like get her to snap out of it. But then later
Right.
she slaps Chris across the face too, which, although it feels much deserved, it's one of those things where a teacher would immediately lose their job these days if they did that.
Oh my God, so much. As someone with a kid, I'd be like, what the hell are you doing touching my child? But in the moment, you're like, well, kind of deserved it, girl. Don't do that. And the movie feels very much of its time, but it's still interesting and understandable for all of that because it captures that time frame so very well.
Yeah, and I sort of want to talk about Amy Irving and William Catt together here because, they're the ones who sort of end up, aside from Miss Collins, feeling bad for Carrie the most, and Tommy Ross goes along with whatever Sue Snell says, pretty much. It
Right.
takes him a while to sort of mull it over and say that he'll ask Carrie to the prom. And it's one of those things where the more he gets to know Carrie, the more he sort of feels sympathy for her and everything she's going through, but he's still the cool guy on campus sort of thing. So, he just has this demeanor about him the whole time where he's making the best of this situation so that it can be better for Carrie. And him and Sue aren't in on Chris's prank at all. And you can see just how Sue realizes what she did at the beginning of the movie was unacceptable and she's trying to make up for it the entire movie. And then she's the only one who makes it out. And I think Amy Irving did a really nice job with sort of going through the motions with her character.
Right. And he at that point when he filmed this, William Catt was like 24, 25, and it's obvious, very obvious he is not a high schooler, but he definitely portrays a high schooler really well in that you kind of get the sense that he's weighing his reputation, how his girlfriend is, whether or not it's worth it. And you kind of see him won over by Carrie, even though not in a romantic way, but in the way of like, oh, dude, I feel really bad for you. You seem to have a good life, and this is something I can do to help you feel better. And he kind of continues to warm to her throughout the entire movie, even though it's all at the impetus of his girlfriend. And you can tell that for her, it's totally like, ugh, that was mean. I shouldn't have done that. And then, even though she also doesn't know Carrie, she still continues to feel for her and warm to her. And it's such a fascinating dichotomy between those two and John Travolta and, what is her name? The Nancy Allen, Chris Hargenson's
Yeah.
character. Like, the dichotomy between those two couples is fascinating because it's very much like one is good and doing their best and trying to be altruistic, and the other is just straight up like, fuck you, bitch. You made me feel bad, so I'm gonna destroy you.
Yeah, and Nancy Allen and John Travolta are two that sort of are worth talking to in the same breath, I guess, because they spend a lot of time together after Billy is introduced because they are sort of planning this prank together and they execute it together as well. And they die
Right.
together. So,
Yeah. And you don't feel bad. When
no.
they die, you're like, I'm clapping. I'm clapping. Golf clap for this because you just hate them so much. They're just on so many levels terrible people.
Yeah, Nancy Allen plays the mean girl so well in this. And it leads to
Right.
one of my favorite moments from the movie, which we'll discuss shortly after this. But I just felt bad for Miss Collins and Tommy Ross, really, during the prom scene, aside from Carrie, of course. But, they were the two innocent ones who weren't in on it. But because Carrie could just see the people laughing at her, including Miss Collins, her brain sort of was like, okay, everyone in this room is going to die.
Right? All y'all gonna die. You're all going down. And it's understandable, especially as someone who is a teenager. Like, it's all or nothing. There is no shades of gray when you're a teenager. You're hurting and you lash out. And that feels very realistic for Carrie. She is trying so hard and she's so delicate and is able to portray these Sissy Spacek, I mean, is able to portray these two sides of someone who's so cut off from the real world and yet wants to be such a part of it. And when she tries, she's just hardcore rejected by the world. And so she lashes out. And that feels authentic. And Sissy Spacek is entirely responsible for that because you feel for her, even though she's so mousy from the beginning until the end.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to dive into some of our favorite moments here. And the one I had just briefly mentioned was when all of the girls were in detention. And their detention was with Miss Collins instead of just being inside, like a study hall sort of thing. So they were out running in place, and Sue just kept telling Chris to shut up. And I just liked how well executed that was because that was really one of the first moments where you knew Sue felt bad about what she did and didn't want to keep going along with Chris's games because she was just so obnoxious and they all wanted to go to prom. So, it was this ultimatum, and I think it was a great one given by Miss Collins. But just to have Sue stand up to Chris in that way and be like, "Will you just shut up already?" It was one of those moments where I was like, "Yes, thank you. Someone finally said something."
Right. That's the point when we see Sue change and decide, like, well, fuck this. I'm not going along with the standard high school regime that is the popular girl sets the tone for everything. She branches out and decides she's going to do something different. I love that scene so much especially because Amy Irving and does it so well. So well. They're able to play off each other in such an authentic way of catty bullshit that comes in high school.
Yeah, definitely. And, there are quite a few scenes to pick from, but that one just really stood out as sort of the switch flipping for Sue. And then we have, these moments between Sue and Tommy later too, where you're like, okay, they're really going to make this work for Carrie. But as far as Carrie goes, one of my favorite moments for her was when she finally stood up to her mom. And even though it is a brutal, brutal scene, you're just like, okay, people are really starting to stand up for themselves in this movie. And obviously, Carrie's mom is one of the main reasons she is the way she is.
Right. And I think the interplay between Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie is so well done. It's such a subtle thing almost between the two of them as they battle it out and have these differing perspectives. And as Carrie like keeps bringing it back to this grounding place of like, no, mama, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go and do what I want and you're not going to stop me anymore. And that feels very powerful. Like Carrie owning it, and then it becomes even more powerful later when she went to all this effort and defied someone who, has defined her life, and then it all goes wrong. And so especially as when I'm rewatching it, I go in knowing that, and it's like, oh honey, you're trying so hard and it's all gonna go wrong for you. And so it's even more powerful on a rewatch than on the initial watching.
Are there any additional moments that you thought were some of your favorites for the film?
For me, honestly, although it's terrible, that first opening scene that De Palma does
Mm-hmm.
is mind blowing because it sets the shower scene where Carrie gets her period and all of the girls make fun of her is a scene that sets the tone for the rest of the film, and it sets the tone for Sissy Spacek's performance throughout it, because she has all of these complicated emotions going on in her face and everyone has to react to that. Like, that scene for me is like, all right, this, and I love it in the book as much as I do in the movie, because it's really harsh, because there are women who go into their periods not knowing what that is, and how shocking and awful must that be. So that for me is a big thing. And then the final scene where Carrie just loses her mind. Those two scenes are kind of juxtaposed as the beginning and the end of her journey as a person, as an adult almost. And I think De Palma does a great job of allowing the viewer to see her growth by showing those two scenes and making the bookends of the film.
Yeah, speaking of De Palma, I want to talk to you about him specifically because, you know, he had such an interesting take on this. Obviously, a lot of things come straight from the book, and you mentioned that opening scene where he just sort of represented that so well. But then, he has these creative choices that he makes later on that I found pretty interesting. And one of the big ones is the split screens during the prom scene. The blood is all over Carrie, and we sort of get these different angles of what's going on as she's sort of tearing the place apart.
Right? I thought, and as you watch it, when you're looking at it from now, where split screen seems like, this is a little tacky. At the time, it was a pretty big deal, like showing those two different juxtapositions of these different scenes. And I think it's well done for the time, but it doesn't age well. You look at it and it feels, okay, we could have done a fast cut and it would have felt more natural, but we're doing this instead. I don't know. How did you react to that watching it now as opposed to when you were younger?
I honestly didn't remember that part of it all that vividly. I remembered the pig's blood being dumped on her and then everything sort of just descending into chaos, but I didn't remember the split screens at all, if I'm being honest. And, just seeing.
And honestly, me neither.
Okay.
I didn't remember it. So it's effective on a certain level, because it's not like it sticks out and jams up the movie, but,
Yeah, the thing I liked about it the most was just being able to see the different angles, especially with the fire hose bit, because, just seeing the fire hose itself wouldn't be all that effective of a shot. You need to see the fire hose and what it's being pointed at. So I think that was a good use for the split screen because it allowed you to see both of those angles. And it was one of those things where even if you don't remember it, you still remember how chaotic the scene was, and the split screen allows you to see more of that.
right. And I think it's a good usage of it. I just think it's become blasé in this time period, so it's hard to look at it from an untainted perspective, I would say. But I think it's an okay use of it, and I think De Palma in particular is great at using that to kind of, it almost feels like it's a like those 360-degree pictures, so that you get a wider perspective of what's going on. And so it just kind of blends into the background for me when I think about it. And I think it was really well done for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else in particular that you want to discuss about De Palma? I feel like you know a bit more about him than I do. Directors, I'll know their names, but I don't really know too many details about some outside of, like Steven Spielberg, for instance. He's a name
Right.
everyone sort of knows. But, I have heard Brian De Palma's name before, but I've just never really taken a look at everything he's done, which is probably a fairly long list.
It's pretty impressive, you know. He was a very famous director, and you know, was still considered a big name. You know, not necessarily Stanley Kubrick, but still pretty big and still making movies to this day. And I think with Carrie, I think his biggest thing, I think, that we look back on is like Scarface or The Untouchables or something like that, very man films.
Right.
And De Palma isn't thought of as the best with his female characters. So the fact that he made this movie, you know, fairly early on in his career. I mean, he started making movies in the 1960s, so 15 years in, but considering how far we've gotten now, that's pretty early.
Right.
So I think this for me is a film that kind of holds Brian De Palma's place of like, well, you can't dismiss him as someone who is only interested in telling stories about men or misogynistic stories or something like that, because this is a very nuanced film about teenage girls and the complex situations that they go through, even though, of course, you know, nobody goes through this exact story, but we all go through transformation and we all have to experience, you know, shame and visited upon us by our peer group and all of that. So I think De Palma is an interesting choice to be the director of this, and I don't think in another time period he maybe would have had a chance at this script, but I think at that time he was a great director to be the one who brought Carrie to life, especially as Stephen King, because of how King is, and this being Stephen King's first movie adaptation. Like, De Palma is, I think this expanded his abilities and probably made him think about things in a different way than he had before. So, and it stuck with his filmmaking. I mean, even in Scarface, you know, I think there's probably a better portrayal of the women in Scarface because he made Carrie. So I like the fact that he did this, and I like the fact that this challenges his usual oeuvre, if you will.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned this was the first Stephen King adaptation to the big screen, especially because I do want to discuss how this translated from the pages to the screen, basically. You know, we do have some big moments in the book that are left out of this movie, especially at the end. And that is basically the government cover up of this story and what really happened. So you have that big part that sort of tells you a lot about the aftermath and the town in general that we don't really get to see come to life in the movie. And, you know, when I rewatched this, part of me was hoping that we would sort of get to see the city as this like barren wasteland, but we don't. And, you know, that was a little disappointing, but I don't think it totally detracts from what De Palma was able to accomplish with the movie.
Right. It almost feels like in the most, what I consider the most controversial movie adaptation ever of Stephen King's work, The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, where I think the adaptation is terrible. It is a terrible adaptation of a book, but it's still an amazing movie.
Yeah.
And this is a very nuanced and separate adaptation because the book is much more about how this event affected the town and the high school and the society that it was part of, whereas the movie is about Carrie and what happened to her and how she lived her life. And I think at the time, like, that's almost necessary because I don't know that audiences then would have been receptive to a more wide-ranging story that you maybe could get away with today. So I like it and I don't like it, you know, it as an adaptation.
Yeah, it's one of those things where clearly we both enjoy the movie, but as far as a direct adaptation, it leaves you wanting a little more. And, you know, I don't really hold that against the movie because a lot of people will bring up how Stephen King ends his novels, and
Yes, they
sometimes
will.
his endings aren't always the best. But I think in the case of Carrie, that one was solid enough to where it felt like there was this underlying importance to that specific moment in the story. And, we don't really know much about the town itself in this movie, which, the town sort of really seemed to play an important part in the book as far as shaping Carrie and these other kids at the school and their parents and everything like that. We don't really get that much of a background on that stuff. We see Carrie's mom, we see Sue's mom, and I think that's it as far as the parents go, really.
Yep. And King always puts value and importance on the surroundings of people in his books. Like, King is all about providing perspective on what these people are going through their daily experiences, and how those kinds of things make people's lives different. And Carrie is definitely, the book is definitely within that line. Uh, but I don't know that it would have translated as well to the screen, because such a almost open-ended view wouldn't have worked as well. And I think King's choice to have it be like, oh, this is a newspaper article, this is a news report, da da da, worked for the book. It definitely worked well, because you feel engaged with it and you feel more interested in, like, oh, well, what happened to this character and how did this affect everything? Whereas in the movie, like, I don't care about the town, I care about Carrie and how everything swirls around her. So it's one of those things where I think, like, when King has a lot of internal dialogue, everything is very mental. It doesn't translate as well to the screen. So I think I like this adaptation more than if it had been like a straight from book to movie. Then I like the interpretation of this.
Yeah, one thing I want to bring up with the movie itself is the runtime, because this is about 98 minutes. And I feel like with older movies, we either have these ridiculously long movies or
Right.
these ones that fall sort of in that 90 to 100-minute range, which personally I love that range for a movie, because these days it
Right.
seems
Me
like
too.
everything is hitting 2 to 2.5 hours. But then you have like these older adaptations that are nearly 3 hours long. And it's just like, wow, that's a lot of movie, guys. And
Right. You get Gone with the Wind, where it's 3 hours, or, this kind of thing where it's like 90 to 100 minutes. And I agree. I'm on the 90 to 100-minute scale. If once a movie hits 2 hours, I'm like, you better be good, because this is a lot of my time I'm investing.
yeah, I've come to expect it with especially the superhero movies and like Star Wars movies and that sort of thing. But for horror movies, I don't really get the feeling that most of them need to be 2 hours long. And I think with this being 98 minutes, if you had added in all of that stuff with the government and with the town and everything like that, you would have been probably close to pushing 2 hours on this. And I know Halloween is coming up and it'll be out by the time everyone is listening to this. And I'm not entirely sure on the length of that, but I feel like, you know, horror movies aren't ones where people are going to be expecting to sit in the theater for like 2.5, 3 hours.
No, it's hard to maintain like a intensity and a momentum
Yeah.
for that long. Otherwise, like, 90 minutes is about what you got, because the rule is that it's 60 minutes. You have the big event, whether it's a chase scene or whatever, and then the 30 minutes after is the cleanup, where you have the climax of the movie. So with horror movies, once you get much beyond that, it becomes like, all right, it feels like it's dragging, even if there's more info being imparted. It just feels slow, and not a whole lot of horror movies can survive feeling slow.
Yeah. And, later in this series, we are going to talk about Stephen King adaptations that are many hours long. You have your
Oh God,
TV
yes.
miniseries that are anywhere from 2 to 6 episodes or something like that, and they can run 3 to 6 hours, give or take. But I feel like with Stephen King, his books can be so long that that time frame is sort of warranted for some adaptations, not all of them by any means. But
Right.
Carrie being his first book and it being of a normal book length, in my opinion, I feel
Right.
like for the adaptation, that 90 to 100-minute mark is a good one to hit for something like that. And I don't recall what The Shining is or anything like that, but that's another book that's a little on the shorter side as far as Stephen King books go. And, it'll be interesting to continue talking about these adaptations and just how some will either seem to drag on or not have quite enough in them. But I feel like this one sort of hit a good balance. While it's not exactly what the book is, it's a good movie to just sit down and watch.
Yeah, Carrie is 98 minutes long. So that's a great carryover. And the new Halloween is 1 hour and 50 minutes long. So we'll see if it can sustain.
Yeah. So it's a little longer. It's about 12 minutes longer, which isn't too bad.
Right. Right. And you can pull that off. So I like De Palma's version of this. I think it's a great adaptation, a great watch, and it gives so many good performances from actors who are now big screen names, or in the past 20 years, in the case of John Travolta, were big screen names. But even Sissy Spacek now, she's in The Old Man and the Gun this year, and she is thought of as like, Hollywood royalty. So I think this is such a great example of a 1970s horror film that pushed the boundaries and allowed Brian De Palma to kind of stretch his wings and do something a little more genre specific. And I think it's so worth watching, even if you're not, a Stephen King fan. This wraps things up really well and feels complete. I know that a lot of the complaints about Stephen King endings is it just kind of comes out of left field and it's not a satisfying one, but this one in the movie is a very satisfying ending.
Yeah, and it would be remiss of us to discuss a horror movie without discussing the score, because
Right.
that is such a big part of horror movies in general. It's like if the music doesn't work, it can totally ruin a horror movie fairly easily.
And look at Halloween, John Carpenter's first movie, where everybody who did the initial screenings was like, this is terrible and I hate it. And so he went and didn't make any changes, just redid the score, and it's the classic that it is today. So yeah, score is such an important part of it, especially for something where it's all about the emotions that you're eliciting in your audience.
Yeah, and the music in this one was done by Pino Donaggio. Never heard of that person, but did a very nice job with this because, it was one of those things where it is a little cheesy, but it's a really old horror movie. So I feel like with horror movies, the score can be a little cheesy and still work out. You could definitely tell when something was going to happen because you sort of had like these screeching strings. Yeah. And it's like,
Out of Psycho,
yes,
almost.
here we go. Here's the action. And you were ready for it. And it was just one of those things that worked so well, sort of. And I don't want to call it campy, but it just fit with the vibe of this movie overall.
Yep, I totally agree. And it looks like I'm looking at their IMDb page, and it looks like that's totally fitting with their set of work. It's lots of horror films, including another Brian De Palma film, Seed of Chucky, Grindhouse, Death Proof. Like, this is someone who it seems really understands how to make something that's not campy, but still interesting to people on a level that isn't, high art or high cinema or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be either. We're not expecting these scores to necessarily win Oscars or anything like that. We just need them to be good
Right?
enough to add to the entertainment of the film, and this definitely accomplishes that.
Right. This is not The Tree of Life, where the score is a huge part of the film, or The Phantom Thread, or something, or a Christopher Nolan film, where like the score is, two-thirds or a third of the movie. This is something where it kicks it over the line almost. So it tells you this is what's coming, because that's what you want in a horror film. You want to feel that tension rise and the hairs on the back of your neck come up, so that when, the slasher actually comes on screen, and that's what the music does. And I think for Carrie, it works well. It's not amazing, but it's pretty damn good.
Yeah, well, are there any final thoughts you have on this movie? If we really wanted to break things down scene by scene, we could probably do major deep dives into most
Like
Stephen
seven
King
hours,
stuff. Yeah, but
right?
I'm trying to keep this to a decent length for our listeners' sake and
It's a
for the
good
sake
problem,
of me
good
sitting in a
idea.
chair in one place for multiple hours does not sound pleasant.
Right? No, my office is super warm, so I get it. I think that the biggest takeaway I can give from this is that if you haven't seen this version of Carrie, please go out and watch it, even if it comes off boring or not as intense as current movies. Like, this is a film that really contributed to the horror dialogue at the time, and it's something that as you watch later horror movies, you can see the shades of this in its progression. So if you haven't seen it, please go out and watch it. It's great.
I concur. And Katie, I know we will be hearing from you quite a bit throughout the duration of this podcast. There are so many Stephen King things to discuss. And while we might not cover every single thing he's done, I'm still debating on the comics because there are a lot more Dark Tower
So
and
many.
Stan comics than I
Right?
realized. And they're still coming out. I keep getting emails about them. I'm like, how
Right.
is this still going?
Carrie is on Amazon Prime. So if you have that, you can always watch it for free on Amazon Prime. And yes, there are so many Stephen King comics. Everybody loves making them. I have read none of them because I'm like, guys, I don't have time for this. I'm sorry.
I might read Road Rage, which is one he did with Joe Hill, just because it's
Oh,
a one off.
yeah.
So I think,
Yep.
I'm still figuring this out as we go here. So it's one of those things where some things will be taken out just because they're so rare. It would cost us like hundreds of dollars to find them and read
Right?
them and track them down and everything. And, that's not something that I would really think of as very fun to do. So,
No.
you know,
No.
we're really just going to have some fun talking Stephen King here. And I know you will be joining me for quite a few episodes. I'm sure I'll be discussing with you soon what we're covering next because I have a ginormous spreadsheet to try and stay organized.
Yes. And I've been reading King since I was like 15, and I read The Shining and couldn't go to bed because I was so terrified about what happened to Danny. So King is my one of my big genre loves. So I'm so glad that we're doing this.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening, if you are enjoying the show, feel free to give us a review over on iTunes. You don't have to if you don't want to. I know it's a bit of a hassle to actually go to the website after you have subscribed to a podcast and everything like that. But either way, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.